You should know what happened this 1150 and why it is the most important event in history. Two children with green skin appeared from beneath the earth in a small English village, speaking a language no one had ever heard, refusing all food but raw beans and claiming they came from a twilight world where everything was green. The boy died, the girl survived, and no one has ever explained where they truly came from. Please let us know in the comments where you are watching this history video and what time you are watching it. And be sure to subscribe to the channel for future videos. Now settle in, because this is not a fairy tale. This is not a legend that was invented centuries after the fact by storytellers looking to entertain. This event was documented by two of the most respected chroniclers of the medieval period, men who had direct connections to the witnesses involved, men who staked their scholarly reputations on the accuracy of what they wrote down. And what they wrote down is, frankly, one of the most baffling accounts in the entire recorded history of the human race. We are going to walk through every single detail of this event. We are going to examine the village, the time period, the people who found these children, the reactions of the community, the behavior of the children themselves, the testimony the surviving girl eventually gave, and then we are going to examine every theory that has ever been put forward to explain what happened. Some of those theories are mundane, some of them are extraordinary, and some of them are so strange that they make the original story seem almost reasonable by comparison. But before we get to the children themselves, you need to understand the world they appeared in. You need to understand 12th century England, because without that context, you cannot appreciate just how shocking, how terrifying, and how utterly inexplicable this event was to the people who lived through it. The year is approximately 1150. Some historians place the event slightly earlier, some slightly later, but the general consensus is that it occurred during the reign of King Stephen of England, which lasted from 1135 to 1154. This is important. The reign of King Stephen was one of the most chaotic, violent, and unstable periods in English history. It is known to historians as the Anarchy, and that name is not an exaggeration. When King Henry I died in 1135, he left no surviving legitimate male heir. His daughter Matilda had been designated as his successor, but Stephen of Blois, Henry's nephew, seized the throne before Matilda could act. What followed was nearly 2 decades of civil war. Barons chose sides, castles were besieged, towns were burned. The fabric of English society, which had been held together by the strong centralized authority of the Norman kings, began to unravel. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, one of the great historical documents of medieval England, described this period in terms that are almost apocalyptic. The chronicler wrote that during Stephen's reign, Christ and his saints slept. He described a land where men were tortured for their gold, where crops were destroyed, where famine stalked the countryside, and where ordinary people lived in constant fear of violence from roving bands of soldiers and mercenaries who owed allegiance to one side or the other, or sometimes to no one at all. This is the England into which our story is set, an England of uncertainty, an England of superstition. An England where the boundaries between the natural and the supernatural were not clearly defined in the minds of ordinary people. An England where the village church was the center of community life, where the priest was often the only literate person for miles around, and where the explanations for unusual events came not from science but from theology, folklore, and fear. Now let us talk about Woolpit itself. Woolpit is a small village in the county of Suffolk, in the eastern part of England. It is located roughly 7 miles from the town of Bury St. Edmunds, which in the 12th century was one of the most important religious centers in the entire country. The great abbey of Bury St. Edmunds, which housed the shrine of the martyred King Edmund, drew pilgrims from across England and beyond. The abbey was wealthy, powerful, and influential, and its reach extended into the surrounding countryside, including the village of Woolpit. The name Woolpit itself is significant, and it gives us a direct connection to the story we are about to tell. The name does not come from wool, as you might assume. It comes from the Old English words meaning wolf pit. Wolf pits were exactly what they sound like. They were deep trenches or pits dug into the ground and concealed with branches and foliage designed to trap wolves. In the early medieval period, wolves were still a serious threat in England. They attacked livestock and occasionally they attacked people. Communities dug these pits as a defensive measure, and over time the pits gave the village its name. By the middle of the 12th century, wolves had become less common in Suffolk, but the pits remained. Some had been partially filled in, some had been repurposed, and some simply sat there in the landscape, open wounds in the earth, overgrown with vegetation, largely forgotten. It was from one of these pits, or from the area immediately surrounding them, that the green children emerged. Think about that for a moment. The very feature that gave this village its identity, these ancient wolf pits carved into the earth, became the site of one of the most mysterious appearances in recorded history. The children did not walk into town along a road. They did not arrive by cart or on horseback. They were found in or near these pits as if they had crawled up out of the ground itself. Now let us talk about our sources, because the credibility of this story rests entirely on the credibility of the men who wrote it down. We have two primary accounts, and both of them come from serious, well-regarded historians of the period. The first account was written by Ralph of Coggeshall. Ralph was the abbot of a Cistercian monastery in Coggeshall, Essex, which is not far from Suffolk. He wrote his account in a work called the Chronicon Anglicanum, which is a chronicle of English history covering the late 12th and early 13th centuries. Ralph was a careful and methodical writer. He was not given to wild flights of fancy. His chronicle is primarily concerned with political and ecclesiastical events, and it is regarded by modern historians as a reliable source for the period it covers. Ralph claimed that his information about the Green Children came from Sir Richard de Calne, a knight who lived near Woolpit and who actually took the children into his household after they were found. This is a direct chain of testimony. The man who housed the children told the story to the man who wrote it down. In terms of medieval historical evidence, this is about as good as it gets. The second account was written by William of Newburgh. William was an Augustinian canon at Newburgh Priory in Yorkshire, and he is one of the most respected historians of 12th century England. His great work, the Historia Rerum Anglicarum, or History of English Affairs, is considered by modern scholars to be one of the most reliable and critically minded historical works of the entire medieval period. William was not credulous. He was not easily fooled. In fact, he is famous for being one of the first English historians to openly reject the legends of King Arthur as fabrications. He called out Geoffrey of Monmouth, the man who popularized the Arthurian legends, as a liar and a fraud. This is the man who wrote about the Green Children, a man who was skeptical of legends, who demanded evidence, who was willing to challenge popular narratives. And yet William included the story of the Green Children in his history, not as a legend or a fable, but as a factual event that he believed had actually occurred. He wrote that he had hesitated for a long time before including the account because it seemed so extraordinary, but that the weight of the testimony from credible witnesses eventually convinced him that it was true. William wrote, and these are his words translated from the Latin, that the event was supported by the testimony of so many witnesses of such weight that it would be impudent to doubt it. That is a remarkable statement from a man known for his skepticism. He is essentially saying that he tried to find reasons to dismiss the story, and he could not. So we have two independent accounts, written by two respected chroniclers, both of whom had access to witnesses or people closely connected to the events. The accounts agree on the essential details, though they differ in some of the specifics, which is actually a sign of authenticity. If the two accounts were identical in every detail, that would suggest one was copied from the other, or that both were drawn from a single fabricated source. The fact that they differ in minor ways while agreeing on the major points suggests that both chroniclers were working from genuine testimony that had been filtered through different witnesses and different memories. Now let us get to the story itself. It was harvest time. The precise date is unknown, but the event occurred during the harvest season, which in 12th century Suffolk would have been late summer or early autumn. The villagers of Woolpit were in the fields, bringing in the crops. This was the most important time of the agricultural year. The entire community would have been mobilized for the harvest. Men, women, and children would have been working from dawn until dusk, cutting grain, binding sheaves, and carting them back to barns and granaries. The success or failure of the harvest determined whether the community would eat well through the winter or face starvation. It was during this time of communal labor and focus that something extraordinary happened. Workers in the fields near the old wolf pits noticed movement. They heard sounds, and when they went to investigate, they found two children. The children were a boy and a girl. The boy appeared to be younger, perhaps around 8 or 9 years old, though exact ages are not given in the sources. The girl was older, perhaps 10 or 11, possibly 12. They were dressed in clothing that no one recognized. The fabric was unusual. The style was unfamiliar. The garments were described as being made of a strange material, though neither chronicler goes into extensive detail about the clothing. What drew everyone's attention, what made the villagers stop and stare and call out to their neighbors to come and see, was not the clothing. It was the skin. The children's skin was green, not a faint tint, not a subtle hue that might be attributed to illness or a trick of the light. The children's skin was distinctly, unmistakably green, both of them, the boy and the girl. Their skin had a green color that the villagers had never seen on any human being before. Try to put yourself in the position of those villagers. You are a 12th century English peasant. Your world is small. You have probably never traveled more than 20 miles from the place where you were born. Your understanding of the world is shaped by the teachings of the church, by the stories and traditions of your community, and by your own daily experience of farming, weather, and the rhythms of the seasons. You know what people look like. You know the range of human skin tones that exist in your part of the world. And now, standing before you are two children whose skin is a color you have never seen on any living person. What do you think? What do you feel? Fear, certainly. Awe, perhaps. Confusion, absolutely. But also curiosity, because these are children. They are small, they are frightened, they are clearly lost and disoriented. Whatever they are, wherever they have come from, they are vulnerable. And the instinct to help a vulnerable child is one of the most powerful instincts in the human species. The villagers approached the children. The children reacted with terror. They cried out, they clung to each other, they shrank back from the villagers' hands. And when the villagers spoke to them, trying to calm them, trying to ask them who they were and where they had come from, the children responded in a language that no one could understand. This is another crucial detail. Woolpit was in Suffolk, in the heart of East Anglia. The people there spoke a form of Middle English that was heavily influenced by the old Anglo-Saxon dialects of the region. They might also have had some familiarity with Norman French, which was the language of the ruling class, and with Latin, which was the language of the church. But the language these children spoke was none of these. It was not English of any dialect. It was not French. It was not Latin. It was not any language that anyone in the village had ever heard before. Some commentators have suggested that the children might have been speaking Flemish, or a dialect of Dutch, or perhaps a Scandinavian language. East Anglia had historical connections to Flanders and to the Scandinavian world, so these are not unreasonable suggestions. But the sources are clear that no one could understand the children, and in a region with trading connections to the continent, at least some people would have had passing familiarity with these languages. The children's speech was described as genuinely unintelligible, not just difficult to understand, but completely foreign. The villagers did what medieval villagers did when confronted with something extraordinary. They took the children to someone in authority. In this case, they brought them to Sir Richard de Calne, the local landowner. Richard de Calne was a knight, a man of property and standing in the community. He had a household, servants, and the resources to care for the children. He was also the man who would later provide testimony about the events to Ralph of Coggeshall. When the children were brought to Richard de Calne's household, the first challenge was practical. The children needed to eat. They were clearly hungry, perhaps even malnourished. But when food was placed before them, they refused it. Every type of food that was offered to them was rejected. Bread, meat, vegetables, porridge. The children would not touch any of it. They looked at the food with what seemed like bewilderment, as if they did not recognize it as food at all. This went on for days. The children were starving, and yet they refused everything that was put in front of them. The members of Richard de Calne's household were growing desperate. These children were going to die of hunger in front of their eyes, and there seemed to be nothing they could do about it. And then someone brought beans into the room. Not cooked beans, not beans that had been dried and prepared, fresh beans still in their stalks, still in their pods, and the children's reaction was immediate and dramatic. They seized the beans with obvious recognition and excitement. They tore open the stalks, looking for the beans inside the pods, but they did not find them immediately. The sources describe the children looking in the hollow of the stalk rather than in the pods, as if they were accustomed to a different type of plant where the edible part was found in a different place. When they were shown that the beans were inside the pods, they ate ravenously. They ate nothing but beans for weeks, possibly even months, raw beans straight from the pod. This was the only food they would accept. Let us pause here and consider what we know so far. We have two children with green skin, speaking an unknown language, wearing unfamiliar clothing, found near ancient pits in the earth, refusing all food except raw beans. Each of these details, taken individually, might be explained away, but taken together they form a pattern that resists easy explanation. The green skin is the most striking detail, and it is the one that has generated the most debate. There are medical conditions that can cause skin discoloration. Chlorosis, or green sickness, is an old term for a type of iron-deficiency anemia that can give the skin a greenish pallor. Hypochromic anemia, a condition in which the red blood cells contain less hemoglobin than normal, can also cause unusual skin coloration. Some researchers have suggested that the children might have been suffering from severe malnutrition, which can cause a range of skin discolorations, including greenish tints. But here is the problem with these medical explanations. They typically produce a subtle discoloration, a pallor, a tint. They do not produce the kind of vivid, unmistakable greenness that the sources describe. The villagers of Woolpit had seen sick people before. They had seen malnourished people before. 12th century England was a place of frequent famine and disease. If the children had merely looked pale or sickly, it is unlikely that their appearance would have been remarkable enough to generate the level of attention and documentation that it did. Moreover, both children were green. If the discoloration were caused by a disease or a nutritional deficiency, it would be unusual for two children of different ages and presumably different constitutions to exhibit exactly the same symptoms to exactly the same degree. Not impossible, but unusual. And then there is the fact that the girl's green color gradually faded over time. As she began to eat a wider range of foods and adapted to life in Woolpit, her skin slowly returned to a normal human color. This is consistent with a nutritional explanation, because if the green color were caused by a specific dietary deficiency, then correcting that deficiency would cause the discoloration to fade. But it is also consistent with other explanations, which we will explore later. Now, back to the story. The boy did not thrive in his new environment. From the beginning, he seemed more affected than his sister by whatever had happened to them. He was weaker, more withdrawn, more frightened. He ate the beans, but he did not eat enough. He did not gain strength. He languished. And then, not long after the children were found, the boy fell ill. The sources do not describe the specific nature of his illness, only that he became sick and that he did not recover. He died in Richard de Calne's household, probably within a few months of his arrival in Woolpit. He was baptized before his death, as was the custom of the time, so that his soul might be saved even if his body could not be. The girl was also baptized, though she was in better health and would survive. The death of the boy is one of the saddest elements of this story. Here was a child ripped from everything he knew, placed in a world he did not understand, surrounded by people whose language he could not speak and whose food he could not eat. He was alone except for his sister, who was his only connection to whatever life they had known before. And he died in a strange house in a strange village under a strange sky, without ever being able to explain who he was or where he had come from. Think about that. Think about the loneliness, the confusion, the fear. Whatever the explanation for the green children of Woolpit, at the heart of it is a human tragedy. Two children were lost, separated from their home, their family, their world. One of them did not survive, and the other was left to navigate a life she had never asked for in a place she had never imagined. The girl, however, proved to be more resilient. Over time, she began to adapt. She began to eat other foods besides beans. She began to learn the language of her hosts. And as she learned to communicate, she began to tell her story. But before we get to her testimony, let us talk about the reaction of the wider community, because the discovery of the green children did not happen in isolation. News traveled in medieval England. It traveled slowly by modern standards, but it traveled. Merchants, pilgrims, traveling friars, soldiers, all of these people moved through the English countryside, and they carried news with them. The story of the green children of Woolpit would have spread outward from the village in ripples, reaching Bury St. Edmunds within days, reaching London within weeks, and eventually reaching the ears of the chroniclers who would preserve it for posterity. The reaction of the medieval English public to this story would have been shaped by their understanding of the world, which was very different from ours. Medieval people believed in a world that was layered with meaning and populated by beings that we would consider supernatural. They believed in angels and demons, in saints and miracles, in fairies and elves and the spirits of the dead. The boundary between the natural world and the otherworld was thin, and it could be crossed in certain places and at certain times. The green children would have been interpreted through this lens. Some people would have seen them as fairy children, beings from the otherworld who had somehow crossed over into the human realm. The color green was strongly associated with fairies in English folklore. Fairies were said to wear green, to live in green places, and to be connected to the green, growing world of nature. The fact that these children had green skin would have immediately suggested a fairy origin to many medieval English people. Others might have seen them as demonic beings, creatures sent by the devil to test or torment the faithful. The medieval church taught that the devil was a master of deception, capable of creating illusions and sending false signs to mislead the unwary. Some people would have viewed the green children with suspicion and fear, wondering what evil purpose lay behind their appearance. Still others might have seen them as a sign from God, a portent or omen of events to come. Medieval people were constantly looking for signs in the natural world, interpreting unusual events as messages from the divine. The appearance of two green-skinned children from beneath the earth would have been seen as deeply significant, though opinions would have differed on exactly what it signified. And some people, perhaps the most practical-minded, would have simply seen two lost, frightened, sick children who needed help. Not everything in the medieval world was filtered through superstition. Ordinary compassion and common sense existed then as they do now, and the fact that the children were taken in, cared for, and fed suggests that at least some of the people of Woolpit responded to them as human beings in need rather than as supernatural curiosities. Now let us return to the girl and to the testimony she eventually gave. As the girl learned English, she was questioned repeatedly about her origins. Where had she come from? Who were her people? How had she arrived in Woolpit? The answers she gave were consistent but extraordinary, and they have puzzled historians, folklorists, and researchers for more than 800 years. The girl said that she and the boy came from a place she called the land of St. Martin. She said that in this land everything was green, the light was green, the vegetation was green. The world existed in a state of perpetual twilight without direct sunlight. There was no bright sun in her homeland, only a dim, diffused light that gave everything a greenish hue. She said that the people of her land were Christian. They knew about St. Martin, the famous Bishop of Tours, who was one of the most widely venerated saints in medieval Europe. This detail is significant because it suggests that the children's homeland, whatever it was, had been reached by Christian missionaries at some point, or at least that the girl was familiar enough with Christian concepts to frame her story in terms that her hosts would understand. She said that across a wide river from her homeland, there was another land where everything was bright and sunlit. She could see this land from her own country, but it was separated from her by the river, and she could not reach it. She described how she and the boy had been tending their father's flocks, or in some versions of the story, had been following their father's cattle. They heard a loud sound, which some versions describe as the ringing of bells, like church bells. They followed the sound, drawn by it, and entered a cave or a tunnel. They walked through this passage in darkness for a long time, until they eventually emerged into the blinding sunlight of the upper world, in or near the wolf pits of Woolpit. The sudden brightness of the sun overwhelmed them. They were disoriented, confused, and frightened. They could not find the entrance to the passage that had brought them to the surface, and before they could get their bearings, they were found by the villagers. This is the girl's testimony. It is the only first-hand account we have of where the green children came from, and it raises as many questions as it answers. Let us examine the key elements of her story one by one. First, the land of St. Martin. Where was this place? The name suggests a Christian community dedicated to St. Martin of Tours. In the 12th century, St. Martin was one of the most popular saints in Western Europe. Churches, monasteries, and communities dedicated to him could be found across England, France, Germany, and beyond. The name alone does not help us identify a specific location, but the girl's description of her homeland does provide some clues. She described a land of perpetual twilight, without direct sunlight, where everything appeared green. This is a vivid and specific description, and it does not match any known geographic location on the surface of the Earth. No place on our planet exists in perpetual twilight with a green-tinted atmosphere, at least not any place that could support a human community with flocks and cattle. Some researchers have suggested that the girl was describing an underground cavern or cave system, illuminated by bioluminescent organisms or by light filtering through vegetation above. There are extensive cave systems in England and across Europe, some of which are large enough to support limited human habitation. But no cave system has ever been found that could support a community of the type the girl described, complete with livestock and agriculture. Others have suggested that the girl's description of her homeland was metaphorical or distorted by the limitations of language. She was a child, speaking a newly learned language, trying to describe a place and experiences that were radically different from anything her listeners had ever known. It is possible that her descriptions were garbled, simplified, or misunderstood. The green twilight of her homeland might have been her way of describing a heavily forested region where the canopy was so thick that direct sunlight never reached the ground. In such a forest, the light would indeed be filtered through green leaves, giving everything a greenish tint, and the overall illumination would be dim, like twilight. This is actually one of the more plausible explanations for the green twilight. Dense old-growth forests existed across much of England in the 12th century, and in the deepest parts of these forests, the canopy would have created exactly the kind of environment the girl described. A child raised in such an environment might genuinely have never seen direct sunlight and might have perceived the world as existing in a state of permanent green-tinted twilight. But this explanation, while plausible, does not account for all the details of the story. If the children came from a nearby forest, someone would presumably have come looking for them. A community with flocks and cattle does not simply fail to notice when two of its children go missing, and the language barrier is hard to explain if the children came from somewhere in England. Even in the 12th century, when regional dialects were strong, a child from another part of England would have spoken a recognizably English language, different from the Suffolk dialect but not completely unintelligible. Second, the river and the bright land beyond it. The girl described a wide river that separated her homeland from another land where everything was bright. This detail has been interpreted in many ways. Some see it as a description of a real geographic feature, perhaps an estuary or a wide river in England or on the European continent. Others see it as a mythological element, reminiscent of the rivers that separate the land of the living from the land of the dead in many mythological traditions. The river Styx in Greek mythology, the river that separates hell from the world of the living in Norse mythology, and similar concepts in Celtic and Germanic folklore all involve rivers that mark the boundary between the ordinary world and the otherworld. If the girl's story contains mythological elements, this raises the question of whether her entire testimony should be understood as a mixture of fact and myth, a real experience filtered through a cultural framework that we do not fully understand. Third, the sound of bells. The girl said that she and the boy followed the sound of bells into the cave or tunnel that led them to the surface world. Bells have profound significance in Christian culture. Church bells call the faithful to worship. They mark the hours of the day. They ring to celebrate births and mourn deaths. In folklore, bells are also associated with the fairy world. In many English folk traditions, the sound of bells can lure people into the otherworld, or it can mark the boundary between the human realm and the realm of the fairies. The sound of bells is also a real phenomenon in the English countryside. The bells of medieval churches could be heard for miles, carrying across the flat landscape of East Anglia with remarkable clarity. If the children were in a cave or tunnel, the sound of church bells from Woolpit or a nearby village might have carried underground, distorted and amplified by the acoustics of the passage, drawing the children toward the surface. Fourth, the cave or tunnel itself. The girl described entering a passage and walking through darkness for a long time before emerging into daylight near the wolf pits. This is perhaps the most intriguing element of her testimony, because it suggests a physical connection between her homeland and the village of Woolpit, a passage through the earth that linked one world to another. 12th century Suffolk is not known for extensive cave systems, but there are natural and artificial underground passages in the region. Old mines, collapsed cellars, drainage tunnels, and natural geological formations could all create passages through the earth. The flint mines at Grimes Graves, located in Norfolk not far from Woolpit, are an extensive network of Neolithic mine shafts that extend deep underground. While these mines predate the 12th century by thousands of years, they were still present in the landscape and could potentially have been encountered by anyone wandering the countryside. It is also possible that the children entered an artificial tunnel of some kind, perhaps a passage associated with a collapsed building, an old fortification, or a monastic cellar. The region around Bury St. Edmunds was dotted with religious houses, and these often had extensive underground cellars and passages. But none of these explanations fully accounts for the girl's description of her homeland. A tunnel might explain how the children arrived in Woolpit, but it does not explain where they came from. Now let us talk about what happened to the girl after she settled into life in Woolpit. This part of the story is less dramatic than the initial discovery, but it is equally important for understanding the full scope of the event. The girl gradually adapted to her new life. She learned English. She began to eat a normal diet, and as she did so, her green skin color slowly faded until she looked like any other English girl. This transformation was noted by both chroniclers and is one of the most significant details in the entire story. The fading of the green color suggests that whatever caused it was not permanent. It was not a genetic trait or a fundamental characteristic of the girl's biology. It was something that could be reversed by changes in diet, environment, or both. This is consistent with the nutritional explanation, the idea that the children's green color was caused by a dietary deficiency that was corrected when they began to eat normal food. But it is also consistent with other explanations. If the children came from an environment where they were exposed to a substance that caused skin discoloration, such as certain minerals, plants, or chemicals, then removal from that environment would cause the discoloration to fade over time as the substance was metabolized and excreted from the body. Arsenic, for example, can cause skin discoloration, and arsenic compounds were present in the soils and waters of some parts of medieval England. Copper compounds can also cause greenish skin discoloration, and copper was mined and processed in various parts of England. If the children came from an area where they were regularly exposed to arsenic or copper, either through their water supply, their food, or direct contact, this could explain their green skin, and the removal from that exposure would explain the gradual fading of the color. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. We will explore the theories in more detail later. For now, let us continue with the girl's story. According to Ralph of Coggeshall, the girl was described as being rather loose in her conduct, a phrase that has been interpreted in various ways by different scholars. Some have taken it to mean that she was wild or undisciplined, which would be understandable for a child from a completely different culture who is still learning the norms and expectations of English society. Others have interpreted it more harshly, suggesting that she was promiscuous or immoral, though this interpretation may reflect the biases of the medieval chronicler rather than any actual behavior on the girl's part. What is clear is that the girl survived, adapted, and eventually integrated into English society. According to the sources, she was baptized, given a Christian name, and eventually married a man from either King's Lynn or Lavenham, depending on which source you follow. She lived out her life as an ordinary English woman, remarkable only for her extraordinary origin. One account suggests that she married a man named Richard Barr, who was an ambassador of King Henry II. If this is true, it means that the girl from the green Twilight world married into the highest levels of English society. Richard Barr was a man of considerable importance, a royal servant who traveled widely and wielded significant influence. That such a man would marry a woman of unknown and mysterious origins speaks to the extraordinary nature of the girl's story and the fascination it held for the people of 12th century England. However, the identification with Richard Barr is not universally accepted by historians, and some scholars believe it is a later addition to the story rather than a reliable historical fact. What we can say with reasonable confidence is that the girl married, settled into English life, and lived long enough to tell her story to multiple people, including the witnesses who eventually spoke to the chroniclers. Now let us step back from the narrative and examine the broader context of the Green Children's story within medieval English culture and folklore. The story of the Green Children is not the only account of mysterious beings emerging from the earth in medieval English tradition. There's a rich folklore of underground worlds, fairy kingdoms, and hidden peoples that stretches back to the pre-Christian Celtic and Germanic traditions that formed the cultural bedrock of English society. In Celtic mythology, the Otherworld was often located beneath the earth, accessible through caves, mounds, and hollow hills. The fairy folk, known by various names including the Sidhe and Irish tradition, were believed to live in these underground realms, emerging occasionally to interact with humans. The fairy mounds of Ireland and Scotland, known as the Sidhe Mounds, were ancient burial cairns and earthworks that were believed to be the entrances to the fairy realm. In English folklore, similar beliefs existed. The hollow hills of English legend were said to be the dwelling places of the fairy folk, who lived in splendid underground palaces furnished with gold and crystal. Humans who entered these places were said to experience time differently, sometimes spending what seemed like a few hours underground only to emerge and discover that years or even centuries had passed in the upper world. The Green Children's story fits neatly into this tradition. Two children emerge from the earth, from a world of green twilight, unable to communicate with ordinary humans, refusing ordinary food. These are all motifs that appear repeatedly in fairy folklore. The association of green with the fairy world is particularly strong. Fairies were said to wear green, to ride green horses, and to inhabit green landscapes. The color green was considered unlucky in some English traditions precisely because of its association with the fairies, who were not always benevolent. But there is a crucial difference between the Green Children's story and a typical fairy tale. The Green Children's story was treated as a factual event by the people who recorded it. Ralph of Coggeshall and William of Newburgh were not writing fairy tales. They were writing history. They included the Green Children in their chronicles alongside accounts of kings, wars, church councils, and other real-world events. They cited witnesses and named names. They treated the story with the same seriousness and attention to detail that they applied to any other historical event. This does not mean that the story is necessarily true as recorded. Medieval chroniclers, like all historians, were products of their time and culture. They had biases, blind spots, and limitations. They may have credulously accepted testimony that a more skeptical observer would have questioned. but their treatment of the story as historical fact rather than folklore is significant because it tells us that the people who lived closest to the event in both time and geography believed that it had actually happened. Let us now begin to examine some of the theories that have been put forward to explain the Green Children of Woolpit. These theories range from the mundane to the extraordinary, and each of them has strengths and weaknesses. The first and most prosaic theory is that the children were ordinary human children who had been lost or abandoned in the countryside. According to this theory, the children's green skin was caused by chlorosis or a similar nutritional deficiency. Their unknown language was a regional dialect that was unfamiliar to the people of Suffolk, and their story about coming from an underground world was either a childish fantasy or a garbled description of a real but ordinary journey. This theory has the advantage of requiring no supernatural or extraordinary explanation. It grounds the story in the real world of 12th century England, where children were sometimes orphaned, abandoned, or lost due to the disruptions of the Civil War. The Anarchy, as we discussed earlier, displaced thousands of people across England. Families were broken up, communities were destroyed, and children were left to fend for themselves. It is entirely possible that two children from a distant part of England or from the continent found themselves wandering the Suffolk countryside, disoriented and malnourished, and that their unusual appearance and unfamiliar language led the villagers of Woolpit to interpret their arrival in supernatural terms. The chlorosis explanation for the green skin is medically plausible. Chlorosis, or green sickness, was a recognized medical condition for centuries. It was associated with iron-deficiency anemia and was most common in young women, though it could affect children of both sexes. The condition gets its name from the greenish tint it gives to the skin, though in most cases the discoloration is subtle rather than dramatic. However, this theory has significant weaknesses. First, the green color. As we discussed earlier, chlorosis typically produces a subtle pallor, not a vivid greenness. The sources describe the children's skin as distinctly green, green enough to astonish and alarm the villagers. If the children merely looked pale or slightly off color, it is unlikely that their appearance would have been noteworthy enough to be recorded by two independent chroniclers. Second, the language. If the children were from England, their language should have been at least partially comprehensible to the people of Suffolk. 12th century English dialects varied considerably from region to region, but they were all recognizably English. A child from Northumbria or Cornwall might have been difficult for a Suffolk farmer to understand, but the language would not have been described as completely unknown. If the children were from the continent, the language barrier is more understandable. Flemish, Dutch, or German would have been unintelligible to most English peasants. But if the children came from Flanders or another part of the continent, how did they end up in rural Suffolk? They would have had to cross the English Channel or the North Sea, a journey that requires a ship. Someone would have seen them, someone would have known about them. Third, the girl's testimony. If the children were ordinary lost children, why did the girl tell such an extraordinary story about her origins? Children do sometimes fantasize, but the girl's account was consistent and detailed. She maintained it over time, even after she had learned English and integrated into English society. If she were simply a lost English or Flemish child, why would she persist in claiming to come from an underground world of green twilight? One possible answer is that the girl's testimony was not accurately recorded. Medieval chroniclers were working from second-hand or third-hand accounts, filtered through memory and interpretation. The girl's original story might have been much more mundane, and the chroniclers or their informants might have embellished it with supernatural elements to make it more interesting or more meaningful. Another possible answer is that the girl genuinely believed her own story. If she came from a very isolated community, perhaps a community living in dense forest or in an unusually remote location, her perception of the world might have been genuinely different from that of the people of Woolpit. She might have experienced her journey to Woolpit as a passage from one world to another, not because she literally traveled through an underground tunnel from a parallel dimension, but because her frame of reference was so different from that of her hosts that the ordinary English countryside seemed as alien to her as the moon. The second major theory is the Flemish immigrant theory, which was developed in detail by the writer and researcher Paul Harris in the 1990s. Harris proposed that the children were Flemish orphans, possibly from the town of Fornham-St. Martin, which is located just a few miles from Woolpit. The name Fornham-St. Martin could have been garbled into the land of St. Martin in the girls' newly learned English. According to Harris's theory, the children's parents were Flemish immigrants who had come to England as part of the wave of Flemish settlement that occurred during the 12th century. Flemish weavers and merchants settled in various parts of England, including East Anglia, during this period. However, Flemish immigrants were not always welcome. During the reign of King Stephen, there were episodes of violence against Flemish settlers. Harris suggests that the children's parents might have been killed in one of these episodes, leaving the children orphaned and alone. The children, traumatized and malnourished, might have wandered the countryside for some time before being found near the wolf pits of Woolpit. Their green skin could have been caused by chlorosis resulting from prolonged malnutrition. Their unknown language would have been Flemish, which would have been unintelligible to English-speaking villagers. And the girl's story about coming from a green twilight world could have been a confused, fragmentary account of her real experiences, distorted by trauma, language difficulties, and the passage of time. Harris further suggested that the children might have been poisoned with arsenic by their guardian, possibly an uncle or a stepfather who wanted to be rid of them. Arsenic poisoning can cause greenish skin discoloration, and it would explain why both children were affected simultaneously. The boy's death might have been caused by the lingering effects of arsenic poisoning rather than by simple malnutrition or illness. This theory is ingenious, and it accounts for many of the details of the story. The proximity of Fornham-St. Martin to Woolpit is particularly compelling. If the girl was trying to say, "I come from St. Martin's" in broken English, her listeners might easily have interpreted this as, "I come from the land of St. Martin," giving her testimony a much more exotic and otherworldly flavor than she intended. The arsenic poisoning explanation for the green skin is also medically plausible. Chronic arsenic exposure can cause a range of skin changes, including discoloration. The fact that both children were affected equally is consistent with exposure to a common source, such as contaminated water or food. However, this theory also has weaknesses. There is no historical record of a massacre of Flemish immigrants at Fornham-St. Martin during the relevant period. While there were episodes of anti-Flemish violence in 12th century England, we have no evidence that they occurred in this specific location at this specific time. The theory requires us to posit events for which we have no independent evidence. Additionally, the theory does not fully account for the girl's detailed description of her homeland. Even if we accept that the land of St. Martin was a garbled version of Fornham-St. Martin, what about the green twilight, the perpetual dimness, the wide river, and the bright land beyond? These details do not match the geography of Fornham-St. Martin or its surroundings. Harris would argue that these details were additions or distortions introduced by the chroniclers or their informants, but this requires us to assume that significant portions of the recorded testimony are inaccurate, which undermines the evidentiary basis of the story. The third major theory takes us into much more speculative territory. This is the idea that the green children came from a parallel world, an alternate dimension or reality that exists alongside our own, but is normally inaccessible. According to this theory, the wolf pits of Woolpit were located at a point where the barrier between dimensions was thin, and the children accidentally crossed from their world into ours. This theory draws on concepts from modern physics, particularly the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, which proposes that every quantum event creates a branching of the universe into multiple parallel realities. In theory, there could be an infinite number of parallel worlds, each slightly different from our own, and some of these worlds might be populated by beings similar to humans but with different characteristics, such as green skin. Now, it is important to emphasize that this theory is entirely speculative. There is no scientific evidence that parallel worlds exist in the form described by this theory, and there is certainly no evidence that people can travel between them by walking through tunnels in the English countryside. The many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics is a mathematical framework for understanding quantum phenomena, not a blueprint for interdimensional travel. But the theory persists because it is one of the few explanations that accounts for all the details of the story as recorded. If the children came from a parallel world, their green skin, their unknown language, their unfamiliar clothing, their ignorance of ordinary food, and the girl's description of a green twilight world all make perfect sense. They were aliens, not in the extraterrestrial sense, but in the dimensional sense, beings from a world that was similar to ours but fundamentally different. The fourth theory is the extraterrestrial theory, which proposes that the children were of alien origin. This theory has been popular in certain circles since the 20th century, when the green children story was adopted by UFO researchers and proponents of the ancient astronaut hypothesis. According to this theory, the children were either aliens themselves or the descendants of aliens who had established a colony on Earth, perhaps underground, perhaps in a remote location, and the green skin was a characteristic of their species. Like the parallel world theory, the extraterrestrial theory accounts for many of the details of the story, but it has no evidentiary support beyond the story itself. There is no physical evidence of alien colonies in Suffolk, no recovered technology, no biological samples, nothing that would substantiate the claim. The theory is popular because it is exciting and because it connects the green children to the broader narrative of extraterrestrial contact that has been a major element of popular culture since the mid-20th century. The fifth theory is the folklore theory, which proposes that the green children story is not a factual account at all, but a piece of folklore that was mistakenly or deliberately presented as history. According to this theory, the story of the green children is a variant of a widespread folk motif, the mysterious child from the Otherworld, and it was incorporated into the chronicles of Ralph of Coggeshall and William of Newburgh because it was circulating in the region as a popular tale and the chroniclers believed or wanted to believe that it was true. This theory has some merit. The motif of mysterious children appearing from underground or from the fairy world is common in English and European folklore. Similar stories exist in many cultures, and the specific details of the green children story, the green skin, the underground world, the strange food preferences, all have parallels in fairy tales and folk legends from across the British Isles and beyond. However, the theory has a significant weakness. Both chroniclers, and especially William of Newburgh, were careful and critical historians who distinguished between factual accounts and popular legends. William explicitly stated that he had hesitated to include the story because of its extraordinary nature, but was convinced by the weight of the testimony. If the story were simply a folk tale, it is difficult to explain why two independent chroniclers, working from different sources, would have treated it as historical fact. There is also the question of the specific details. Folk tales tend to be schematic and formulaic. They follow predictable patterns and use stock characters and motifs. The green children story, while it contains folkloric elements, also contains specific, concrete details that are unusual in folklore but typical of factual accounts. The naming of Richard de Calne as the children's host, the specific location of Woolpit, the description of the children's behavior around food, these are the kinds of details that suggest a real event rather than a generic folk tale. Let us now explore some additional dimensions of this story that are often overlooked in popular accounts. One of the most interesting aspects of the green children story is its relationship to the medieval concept of the Otherworld. In medieval English culture, the Otherworld was not a single, clearly defined place. It was a concept that encompassed multiple ideas about what lay beyond the boundaries of the ordinary world. The Otherworld could be the realm of the dead, the kingdom of the fairies, the abode of angels, or a distant land beyond the known world. These different concepts overlapped and blended in the popular imagination, and a story like The Green Children could be interpreted through any of these lenses. The girl's description of her homeland has elements that resonate with several of these otherworld concepts. The green twilight is reminiscent of descriptions of the fairy world, which was often depicted as a place of eternal twilight, neither fully light nor fully dark. The wide river separating her homeland from a bright land beyond it echoes the rivers of the underworld in classical and Norse mythology. The sound of bells that led the children out of their world is a motif found in both Christian and fairy traditions. This layering of meanings is characteristic of medieval storytelling. A medieval audience would not have been troubled by the ambiguity. They would have been comfortable with the idea that the Green Children's story could mean different things on different levels, that it could be both a factual account of a real event and a symbolic narrative about the relationship between the human world and the otherworld. Modern readers, accustomed to the sharp distinction between fact and fiction, tend to want a single, definitive explanation. Either the story is true or it is not. Either the children were real or they were invented. But the medieval mind did not draw such sharp distinctions. For a medieval audience, the story of the Green Children was true in a way that transcended the simple question of whether it literally happened as described. This does not mean that the story is fictional. It means that our approach to evaluating it needs to be more nuanced than a simple true or false judgment. The story may contain a core of factual truth that has been shaped and embellished by the cultural expectations and interpretive frameworks of the people who experienced it and the people who recorded it. Let us also consider the geographic context of the story in more detail. Woolpit is located in the heart of East Anglia, a region with a distinctive history and culture. East Anglia was one of the most prosperous parts of medieval England, thanks to its fertile soil and its thriving wool trade. It was also one of the most cosmopolitan, with strong trade links to Flanders, the Low Countries, and the Baltic region. Ships from across northern Europe docked at the ports of East Anglia, bringing goods, people, and ideas from distant lands. This cosmopolitan character makes East Anglia both a more and a less likely setting for the Green Children story. On the one hand, the presence of foreign traders and immigrants means that the people of East Anglia would have been more familiar with foreign languages and foreign customs than people in more isolated parts of England. This makes it harder to explain why no one could understand the children's language. If the children were speaking Flemish or Dutch, someone in East Anglia should have recognized it. On the other hand, the cosmopolitan nature of East Anglia means that the region was a place where unusual things happened, where strangers appeared, where the unexpected was part of the fabric of daily life. A story like The Green Children might have been more likely to emerge from such a region precisely because the people there were more open to the idea that the world contained things they did not understand. The physical landscape of East Anglia is also relevant. The region is flat, low-lying, and in places marshy. The fens, a vast area of wetlands to the north and west of Woolpit, were one of the most mysterious and dangerous landscapes in medieval England. The fens were home to isolated communities that lived on artificial islands in the marshes, and these communities were often cut off from the outside world for months at a time by flooding. The people of the fens had their own distinct culture, their own dialects, and their own way of life, and they were often regarded with suspicion and fear by people from other parts of England. Could the Green Children have come from one of these isolated fen communities? It is possible. A child raised in the depths of the fens might have had limited exposure to the wider world, might have spoken a dialect that was nearly unintelligible to outsiders, and might have experienced the flat, waterlogged, green landscape of the fens as a world unto itself, a world of green twilight where the horizon was always shrouded in mist and the sun was rarely visible through the perpetual haze. But the fens are to the north and west of Woolpit, and the girl described her homeland as being separated from a bright land by a wide river. The geography does not quite fit, and the Fen communities, while isolated, were not unknown to the people of Suffolk. Someone would have recognized a Fen dialect, even if they could not fully understand it. Another geographic possibility is that the children came from a mining community. Mining was an important activity in medieval England, and miners and their families sometimes lived in conditions that were very different from those of ordinary agricultural communities. Miners worked underground, in tunnels and shafts that could extend for considerable distances. Their children might have spent significant time underground, and their exposure to certain minerals could have affected their health and appearance. The flint mines at Grimes Graves, which we mentioned earlier, are located in Norfolk, within a day's walk of Woolpit. These mines were ancient even in the 12th century, having been in use since the Neolithic period, but there is no evidence that they were actively worked in the 12th century, and they are not the kind of mines that would support a resident community with livestock. Lead and tin mines existed in other parts of England, particularly in the West Country and in the Pennines. Exposure to lead can cause a range of health problems, including skin discoloration, though lead poisoning typically produces a gray or pallid appearance rather than a green one. Copper mines, which could produce green-tinted skin discoloration through exposure to copper compounds, existed in Wales and in parts of northern England. But all of these mining locations are far from Woolpit, and there is no obvious route by which children from these communities would have ended up in Suffolk. The theory requires too many assumptions and too many leaps of logic to be convincing. Let us now turn to a different aspect of the story, one that is often overlooked in discussions of the Green Children. This is the question of why the story was preserved. In the 12th century, writing was a rare and expensive activity. Parchment, ink, and the labor of scribes were costly, and the limited resources available for writing were directed toward subjects that were considered important. The fact that two respected chroniclers devoted space in their works to the Green Children tells us that the story was considered significant by the people of the time. But significant in what way? Ralph of Coggeshall and William of Newburgh were primarily interested in political and ecclesiastical history. Their chronicles are filled with accounts of kings, wars, church councils, and the affairs of great lords. The Green Children story does not fit neatly into any of these categories. It is an anomaly, a strange interruption in the flow of political narrative. William of Newburgh included the story in a section of his chronicle that deals with wonders and prodigies, unusual events that he believed were worthy of record even though they did not fit into the main narrative of English political history. He treated the Green Children as a phenomenon that demanded attention precisely because it was inexplicable. He was not trying to prove a political point or advance a theological argument. He was simply recording something that he believed had happened and that he could not explain. Ralph of Coggeshall's treatment is similar. He includes the story as one of several remarkable events that occurred during the period he was covering, alongside accounts of miracles, visions, and other extraordinary phenomena. For Ralph, the Green Children were part of a larger pattern of wondrous events that demonstrated the mysterious workings of God in the world. This tells us something important about how the medieval mind processed the unexplained. Where a modern observer might try to reduce the Green Children to a single, rational explanation, a medieval observer was comfortable with mystery. The Green Children were a sign, a wonder, a manifestation of the unknown depths of God's creation. They did not need to be fully explained. They needed to be recorded, witnessed, and contemplated. There is a wisdom in this approach that we might do well to consider. Not everything can be explained. Not everything should be reduced to a single, tidy theory. Sometimes the most honest response to the unknown is simply to say, "This happened, and we do not know why." But of course, the human desire to understand is powerful, and the Green Children story has continued to attract theorists and researchers for more than 8 centuries. In the modern era, the story has been examined by historians, folklorists, anthropologists, medical researchers, physicists, and paranormal investigators, each bringing their own tools and perspectives to bear on the mystery. Let us examine what modern science can tell us about the physical aspects of the story, specifically the green skin and the children's dietary behavior. The green skin is the most medically interesting aspect of the story. As we have discussed, there are several conditions that can cause greenish skin discoloration. Chlorosis or iron-deficiency anemia is the most commonly cited, but there are others. Hypochromic anemia, in which the red blood cells are paler than normal due to reduced hemoglobin content, can give the skin a greenish or yellowish tint. This condition can be caused by iron deficiency, chronic disease, or lead poisoning, among other factors. Argyria, a condition caused by chronic exposure to silver compounds, can cause the skin to turn a blue-gray color. While this is not green, it demonstrates that environmental exposure to certain metals can cause permanent or semi-permanent changes in skin color. Copper exposure is perhaps the most relevant to our story. Copper compounds are green, and chronic exposure to copper, whether through ingestion, inhalation, or skin contact, can cause a range of health effects, including skin discoloration. The green color of the children's skin could theoretically be explained by chronic exposure to copper-rich soil, water, or food. Interestingly, arsenic exposure, which Paul Harris proposed as part of his Flemish orphan theory, can also cause skin changes, though these are typically more complex than a simple color change. Chronic arsenic exposure can cause hyperpigmentation, which means darkening of the skin, and it can also cause a condition known as arsenical keratosis, in which the skin develops thickened, discolored patches. In some cases, arsenic exposure can give the skin a grayish or greenish tint, though this is not the most common presentation. The children's dietary behavior is also medically interesting. Their initial refusal of all food except raw beans could have several explanations. If the children were severely malnourished, their digestive systems might have been unable to tolerate rich or complex foods. Beans, which are relatively easy to digest when fresh and raw, might have been the only food that their impaired digestive systems could handle. Alternatively, the children's preference for beans might have been cultural rather than medical. If they came from a community where beans were a staple food and other foods were unfamiliar, they might have refused unfamiliar foods out of cultural preference rather than medical necessity. Children are often conservative eaters even under normal circumstances, and children who have been traumatized are even more likely to reject unfamiliar foods. The gradual expansion of the girl's diet and the concurrent fading of her green skin color suggest a connection between the two phenomena. As she ate a more varied and nutritious diet, her health improved and her skin returned to a normal color. This is consistent with the nutritional explanation for the green skin. It suggests that the green color was caused by a dietary deficiency that was corrected as the girl began to eat normally. But which dietary deficiency? Iron deficiency is the most commonly cited candidate, and it is plausible. Iron is essential for the production of hemoglobin, the protein in red blood cells that carries oxygen and gives blood its red color. When iron is deficient, hemoglobin levels drop and the skin can take on a pale, greenish appearance. Fresh beans contain iron, so the children's preference for beans would have provided some iron, helping to explain the gradual improvement in their condition. However, iron deficiency alone is unlikely to produce the dramatic greenness described in the sources. Other factors must have been at work. It is possible that the children's green appearance was the result of multiple factors acting in combination: a dietary deficiency, environmental exposure to green tinting substances, and perhaps even a cultural practice such as the use of green dye or pigment on the skin. This last possibility, that the children's green skin was the result of deliberate pigmentation rather than a medical condition, is rarely considered but not impossible. Many cultures throughout history have practiced body painting or skin decoration using natural pigments. If the children came from a culture that used green pigment on the skin, whether for decorative, religious, or protective purposes, this would explain their green appearance upon discovery and the gradual fading of the color as the pigment wore off in the absence of reapplication. But we have no evidence for such a practice in 12th century England or anywhere else in medieval Europe, so this remains pure speculation. Let us now consider the psychological dimensions of the story. The green children, whatever their origin, were children who had been separated from their home, their family, and everything they knew. They were placed in an alien environment where they could not communicate, where the food was unfamiliar, and where they were objects of curiosity, fear, and wonder to the people around them. The psychological impact of such an experience on a child would be profound. Modern research on refugee children, displaced children, and children who have experienced extreme cultural dislocation provides some insight into what the green children might have gone through. Children who are suddenly removed from their familiar environment and placed in an alien culture often experience a range of psychological symptoms, including withdrawal, selective mutism, refusal to eat, regression to earlier stages of development, and difficulty forming attachments. The boy's decline and death might have been partly due to psychological factors, a child who simply could not adapt to his new reality and who lost the will to live. The girl's survival and eventual integration, on the other hand, suggest a greater psychological resilience. She was older, which might have given her more cognitive resources to cope with the situation. She was also, perhaps, more temperamentally suited to adaptation. Some children are naturally more flexible, more curious, more willing to embrace new experiences, and the girl might have been one of these children. Her willingness to learn English, to eat new foods, and to participate in the life of the community all suggest an active engagement with her new world rather than a passive acceptance of it. She was not simply surviving, she was building a new life, and the fact that she eventually married and became a functioning member of English society is a testament to the human capacity for adaptation in even the most extraordinary circumstances. But what did she carry with her? What memories, what feelings, what sense of loss did she bear throughout her life? We will never know. The sources tell us what the girl said about her homeland, but they tell us nothing about how she felt about leaving it behind. They tell us that she integrated into English society, but they do not tell us whether she was happy, whether she mourned her brother, whether she dreamed of the green twilight world she had left behind. This is one of the frustrations of studying medieval history. The sources are focused on events, on facts, on the external world. The inner lives of the people they describe are largely invisible to us. We can speculate, we can imagine, but we cannot know. As we bring this first part of our exploration to a close, let us summarize what we have established. In or around the year 1150, during the reign of King Stephen, 2 children with green skin were found near the wolf pits in the village of Woolpit, Suffolk, England. They spoke an unknown language and refused all food except raw beans. They were taken into the household of Sir Richard de Calne, a local knight. The boy died within months. The girl survived, learned English, and eventually told her story. She claimed to come from a place called the Land of St. Martin, a world of green twilight where everything was dim and green, separated from a bright land by a wide river. She said she and the boy had followed the sound of bells into a cave and emerged in Woolpit. Her green skin gradually faded as she adapted to a normal diet, and she eventually married and lived out her life as an English woman. The story was recorded by 2 independent chroniclers, Ralph of Coggeshall and William of Newburgh, both of whom treated it as a factual event rather than a legend. Multiple theories have been proposed to explain the event, including nutritional deficiency, Flemish immigration, arsenic poisoning, parallel dimensions, extraterrestrial contact, and folklore. None of these theories fully accounts for all the details of the story. The green children of Woolpit remain one of the great unsolved mysteries of medieval history. They challenge our assumptions about what is possible, about the boundaries of the known world, and about the limits of human experience. They remind us that the past is a foreign country, a place where the rules we take for granted did not always apply, and where things happen that we cannot easily explain. In the second part of this documentary, we will delve even deeper into the theories surrounding the green children. We will examine the story's influence on literature, popular culture, and the study of anomalous phenomena. We will look at what modern researchers have uncovered about the geography, demographics, and social conditions of 12th century Suffolk. We will examine the parallels between the Green Children's story and similar accounts from other cultures and other time periods. And we will attempt to reach some kind of conclusion, however tentative, about what really happened near the wolf pits of Woolpit more than 850 years ago. Because this story is not just about two children with green skin. It is about the nature of mystery itself. It is about the human need to explain the unexplainable, to categorize the uncategorizable, to fit the unfittable into the neat boxes of our understanding. And it is about the possibility, the tantalizing, terrifying, wonderful possibility that there are things in this world that we do not understand, things that exist beyond the boundaries of our knowledge, things that remind us how small we are and how vast the universe truly is. The boy died in a strange land, far from everything he knew. The girl survived, but she carried a secret that no one could fully comprehend. And the people of Woolpit were left with a story that has echoed through the centuries, growing louder with each retelling, demanding attention, demanding explanation, demanding that we look beyond the surface of things and ask the most fundamental question of all. What is real? What lies beneath the surface of the world we think we know? What other worlds might exist just beyond the threshold of our perception, waiting to be discovered, waiting to reveal themselves, waiting for someone to follow the sound of the bells into the darkness and see what lies on the other side? The Green Children followed the bells, and they found our world, but where did they come from, and could it happen again? These are the questions we will continue to explore. These are the questions that have haunted historians, scientists, and storytellers for more than 8 centuries. And these are the questions that make the Green Children of Woolpit not just a historical curiosity, but one of the most profound and unsettling mysteries in the entire chronicle of human experience. The year was 1150, the place was Woolpit, and 2 children with green skin emerged from the earth and changed the way we think about the boundaries of the possible. Stay with us. The second part of this journey is still to come, and the deeper we go, the stranger it gets. We have talked about the world the children entered, the England of the Anarchy, the Suffolk of wolf pits and wheat fields, the medieval cosmos of saints and fairies, and the thin boundary between the known and the unknown. We have talked about the chroniclers who preserved the story and the chain of testimony that connects the written accounts to the events themselves. We have talked about the children's appearance, their behavior, their language, and the girl's eventual testimony about her origins. But there is still so much more to explore. There are dimensions of this story that we have barely touched upon, questions that we have raised but not fully addressed, threads that we have begun to follow but not yet traced to their ends. In particular, we have not yet fully explored the question of what happened to the entrance of the tunnel or passage through which the children claim to have arrived. If the children emerged from a physical passage in or near the wolf pits, where is that passage now? Was it ever found? Did anyone ever go looking for it? The sources do not tell us directly, but we can make some inferences. The wolf pits of Woolpit were real physical features of the landscape. They were well known to the local population. After the children were found, it is reasonable to assume that curious villagers would have examined the area around the pits, looking for the passage the children described. But no such passage was ever reported. This could mean several things. It could mean that the passage was too small or too well hidden to be found. It could mean that the passage had collapsed or been filled in by the time people went looking for it. It could mean that the passage was not a physical tunnel at all, but something else entirely, a metaphorical passage, a dimensional gateway, a shift in consciousness that the girl described in physical terms because she had no other language for it. Or it could mean that there was no passage, that the children did not emerge from underground at all, and that the underground journey was a later addition to the story or a misinterpretation of what the girl actually said. We simply do not know. And that is the fundamental challenge of studying the Green Children of Woolpit. At every turn, the evidence gives us just enough to tantalize, but not enough to conclude. We are left perpetually on the threshold, peering into the darkness, hearing the echo of bells, but never quite reaching the other side. This state of uncertainty is uncomfortable for modern minds accustomed to definitive answers. We want to know what happened. We want to identify the children, locate their homeland, explain their green skin, and close the case. But the green children resist closure. They resist easy answers. They resist being reduced to a single explanation, and perhaps that is their greatest gift to us. In a world where we are increasingly confident that we have everything figured out, the green children of Woolpit remind us that there are still mysteries, still questions without answers, still events that defy our categories and challenge our assumptions. The 12th century was a time of great change and great uncertainty. The old order was breaking down, and the new order had not yet fully emerged. The people of that era lived with ambiguity, with mystery, with the constant awareness that the world was larger and stranger than they could comprehend. We live in a different kind of era, but the fundamental human condition has not changed. We are still surrounded by mystery. We still encounter events and phenomena that we cannot explain, and we still have to decide how to respond with fear, with curiosity, with denial, or with the humble acknowledgement that there are things we do not know. The green children of Woolpit invite us to choose curiosity. They invite us to look at the world with fresh eyes, to question our assumptions, to consider the possibility that the reality we take for granted is not the only reality there is. And on that note, we will pause. Part 1 of our exploration is complete. We have laid the groundwork, established the facts as far as they are known, and begun to explore the theories and interpretations that surround this extraordinary event. In Part 2, we will go deeper, much deeper. We will examine the most radical theories about the green children's origins. We will explore the connections between the Woolpit story and similar accounts from around the world. We will look at the latest scholarship on the subject. And we will ask the ultimate question that this story poses, a question that goes beyond history, beyond folklore, beyond science, and touches on the very nature of reality itself. What if the girl was telling the truth? What if there really is a world of green twilight beneath our feet? A world where everything is dim and strange and different, a world that exists just beyond the reach of our senses, separated from us by nothing more than a thin layer of earth and a tunnel that no one can find. What if the green children were exactly what they appeared to be, visitors from another world, travelers who stumbled through a gap in the fabric of reality and found themselves in a place they could never have imagined? It is a question worth asking, it is a question worth sitting with, and it is a question that we will return to with full force in Part 2. Until then, remember the children. Remember the boy who did not survive and the girl who did. Remember the green skin and the raw beans and the sound of bells echoing through an underground passage. Remember the village of Woolpit and the ancient wolf pits and the flat, fertile fields of Suffolk where the harvest was being gathered when two impossible children appeared from the earth. Remember and wonder, because that is what the green children ask of us. Not that we explain them, not that we categorize them, not that we reduce them to a footnote in a history book, but that we wonder. That we open ourselves to the possibility that the world is stranger and more beautiful and more terrifying than we have ever imagined. The green children of Woolpit. The year was 1150, and the mystery endures. We left off standing at the edge of a mystery that has refused to die for more than 850 years. Two children with green skin, speaking a language no one recognized, emerged from the earth near the ancient wolf pits of a small English village called Woolpit. The boy died. The girl survived. She told a story about a twilight world where everything was green, about following the sound of bells through an underground passage, about emerging into blinding sunlight and finding herself in a place she did not recognize and could not understand. We examined the historical context, the sources, the basic facts of the case, and the most commonly cited theories. We looked at chlorosis, at Flemish immigration, at arsenic poisoning, at parallel dimensions, at extraterrestrial origins, and at the possibility that the entire story is a piece of folklore that was mistakenly treated as history. Now we go deeper, because the story of the green children of Woolpit does not exist in isolation. It is connected to a web of similar accounts, similar mysteries, and similar questions that stretch across centuries and across continents. The green children are not the only mysterious beings to have appeared from beneath the earth. They are not the only strangers to have arrived in a community speaking an unknown language and bearing marks of an origin that no one could explain. And they are not the only figures in history whose story forces us to confront the limits of what we think we know about the world. In this second part of our exploration, we are going to follow every thread. We are going to examine the parallels between the Woolpit story and similar accounts from other cultures and other eras. We are going to look at the latest scholarly research on the green children. We are going to examine the story's impact on literature, art, and popular culture. We are going to push every theory to its logical conclusion and see which ones survive the pressure. And we are going to wrestle, honestly and openly, with the question that this story ultimately poses. What really happened at Woolpit? Let us begin by returning to the girl's testimony, because there are elements of it that we touched on in part 1 but did not fully explore. The girl said that she came from the land of St. Martin. She said that this land existed in a state of perpetual twilight without direct sunlight. She said that everything there was green. She said that across a wide river from her homeland, there was another land that was bright and sunlit. She said that she and the boy had been following their father's flocks when they heard the sound of bells. They followed the sound into a cavern or tunnel. They walked through darkness for a long time, and they emerged near the wolf pits of Woolpit, blinded by sunlight they had never experienced before. Now, there is a detail in some versions of the testimony that is often overlooked, and it is one of the most intriguing details in the entire story. The girl said that the people of her homeland were Christians. They worshipped God. They knew about St. Martin. They had churches. They had a recognizable social structure with farmers and herders and presumably some form of governance. This detail is crucial because it eliminates one category of explanation. If the girl's homeland were truly an alien world, whether in the extraterrestrial or the interdimensional sense, it would be extraordinarily unlikely that its inhabitants would be Christians who venerated a specific Christian saint. Christianity is a human religion tied to a specific historical tradition, a specific set of scriptures, and a specific chain of missionary activity. The fact that the girl described her people as Christians strongly suggests that her homeland, whatever and wherever it was, had been in contact with the Christian world at some point in its history. This does not mean that the girl's homeland was necessarily in England or even in Europe. Christianity had spread widely by the 12th century, reaching parts of Africa, Asia, and even, according to some traditions, parts of the world that were unknown to Western Europeans. But the specific veneration of St. Martin of Tours narrows the geographic possibilities considerably. St. Martin was primarily venerated in Western Europe, with his cult being especially strong in France, Germany, the Low Countries, and England. A community that venerated St. Martin was almost certainly located within the orbit of Western European Christianity. This brings us back to the Fornam St. Martin theory proposed by Paul Harris. Fornam St. Martin is a village located just a few miles from Woolpit, and its name literally means the village of St. Martin. If the girl was trying to say that she came from a place called St. Martin's, and if her newly learned English was imperfect, her listeners might easily have interpreted, "I come from St. Martin's," as "I come from the land of St. Martin," transforming a mundane geographic reference into something that sounded like a fairy tale. But let us push this theory further than Harris did. Let us really examine whether Fornam St. Martin could plausibly be the girl's homeland, and let us see where the theory breaks down. Fornam St. Martin is located approximately 5 miles northwest of Woolpit. In the 12th century, it was a small agricultural settlement, similar in size and character to Woolpit itself. It was not located in a forest. It was not underground. It was not in a state of perpetual twilight. It was an ordinary Suffolk village, sitting on ordinary Suffolk farmland, under the same sky as Woolpit. How then could a child from Fornam St. Martin describe her homeland as a place of green twilight where the sun never shone? There are several possible answers, none of them entirely satisfying. One possibility is that the girl was not describing Fornam St. Martin itself, but a specific location within or near it. Perhaps her family lived in a heavily wooded area, a dense copse or a stretch of old-growth forest where the canopy was thick enough to block direct sunlight. In such a location, the light filtering through the leaves would indeed have a greenish quality, and a child raised entirely within this environment might genuinely have perceived the world as existing in green twilight. Another possibility is that the girl's description of her homeland was not a literal account of its physical characteristics, but a subjective impression colored by her psychological state. If she and the boy had been confined to a dark space, perhaps a cellar, a barn, or an underground chamber, for an extended period before their escape, her memory of her homeland might have been dominated by the darkness and dimness of her confinement rather than by the actual landscape of the area. This second possibility opens up a much darker interpretation of the story. What if the children were not lost travelers from a distant land but prisoners, children who had been held captive in a dark, enclosed space, deprived of sunlight and adequate nutrition, and who eventually escaped through a passage or tunnel and emerged near the wolf pits of Woolpit? This interpretation would explain the green skin as a result of severe malnutrition and vitamin D deficiency caused by prolonged deprivation of sunlight. It would explain the children's refusal to eat unfamiliar food as a consequence of their limited diet during captivity. It would explain the unknown language as a result of social isolation. If the children had been confined from a very young age, they might have developed their own private language or retained a language learned from their captor that was different from the local dialect. And it would explain the girl's description of a green twilight world as a traumatized child's memory of a dark, enclosed space. This theory is deeply unsettling, but it is not without historical parallel. Children have been held captive in basements, cellars, and other enclosed spaces throughout history, and the physical and psychological effects of such confinement are well documented. Prolonged deprivation of sunlight causes vitamin D deficiency, which leads to a range of health problems including bone deformities, muscle weakness, and skin changes. Severe malnutrition, particularly iron deficiency, can cause the greenish skin discoloration known as chlorosis. And the psychological effects of prolonged confinement, including language regression, social withdrawal, and distorted perceptions of the world, are all consistent with the behavior described in the Green Children accounts. The boy's death could be explained by the cumulative effects of prolonged abuse and neglect. He was younger and perhaps more physically fragile, and his body could not recover from the damage that had been done to it, even after he was rescued and placed in a caring environment. The girl, being older and perhaps more resilient, was able to recover, both physically and psychologically, and to eventually build a new life. This is a theory that no one particularly wants to embrace because it replaces a charming mystery with a grim reality, but we must consider it because our obligation is to the truth, whatever that truth may be, and not to the preservation of a comfortable narrative. However, this captivity theory also has weaknesses. If the children had been held captive nearby, someone in the community would likely have known about it. Medieval villages were small, close-knit communities where everyone knew everyone else's business. Holding two children captive for years without anyone noticing would have been extremely difficult. And if the children had escaped from captivity, one would expect them to have shown signs of physical abuse, such as scars, broken bones, or other injuries, which the sources do not mention. Furthermore, the girl's testimony includes details that are difficult to explain as the memories of a captive child. She described a community with flocks and herds, with churches, with a recognized patron saint. She described a wide river and a bright land beyond it. These are not the descriptions of a cellar or a barn. They are descriptions of a landscape, a world, a place with geography and social structure. So we are left, once again, without a definitive answer. The captivity theory explains some elements of the story, but not others. Like every other theory we have examined, it illuminates certain aspects of the mystery while leaving others in darkness. Let us now turn to the parallels between the Green Children story and similar accounts from other cultures and other time periods. Because if the green children of Woolpit were unique, if there were no other stories like theirs anywhere in the world, we might be justified in dismissing the account as an isolated curiosity, a one-time event that defies explanation but has no broader significance. But the green children are not unique. Similar stories exist in cultures across the globe, and the patterns that emerge from these stories are both fascinating and deeply puzzling. The most famous parallel is the story of the green children of Banjos, which is set in Spain. According to this account, which is usually dated to August 1887, two children with green skin were found near a cave in the town of Banjos in the province of Barcelona. Like the Woolpit children, they spoke an unknown language and refused to eat normal food. Like the Woolpit children, the boy died and the girl survived. And like the Woolpit girl, the surviving child eventually told a story about coming from a dark, sunless land. The Banjos story is strikingly similar to the Woolpit account, so similar, in fact, that many researchers believe it is a retelling of the Woolpit story rather than an independent event. There is no contemporary documentation of the Banjos incident. The earliest known written accounts date from the 20th century, hundreds of years after the event supposedly occurred. No town called Banjos has been conclusively identified in the province of Barcelona, and the details of the story match the Woolpit account so closely that direct influence seems almost certain. However, some researchers have argued that the Banjos story is an independent event that bears a coincidental resemblance to the Woolpit account. They point out that the specific details differ in some respects, and they argue that the similarities could be explained by the fact that both events, if they occurred, involved the same type of phenomenon, whatever that phenomenon might be. The debate over the Banjos story illustrates a broader problem in the study of anomalous phenomena. When similar stories appear in different cultures and different time periods, how do we determine whether they represent independent occurrences of the same phenomenon or simply the diffusion of a single story that has been adapted and relocated by successive storytellers? This is not an easy question to answer, and the methodology for answering it is the subject of ongoing debate among folklorists, historians, and researchers of the paranormal. Beyond the Banjos parallel, there are numerous other accounts from around the world that share elements with the green children story. Let us examine some of the most significant ones. In Japanese folklore, there is a tradition of beings who emerge from underground worlds. The Tsuchigumo, or earth spiders, were said to live in caves and underground tunnels, and they were sometimes depicted as having unusual physical characteristics. While the Tsuchigumo are not directly comparable to the green children, the underlying concept of underground beings who occasionally surface in the human world is a shared motif. In the mythology of the indigenous peoples of many regions, there are accounts of underground worlds populated by beings who are similar to humans but different in important ways. The Hopi people of the southwestern region have a creation narrative in which humanity emerged from a series of underground worlds, ascending through each one until they reached the surface of the earth. Each underground world had its own characteristics, its own light, and its own atmosphere. The parallels with the green children's description of a twilight world beneath the surface are intriguing. The Celtic tradition, which we touched on in Part 1, is particularly rich in accounts of underground worlds and fairy kingdoms. The Tuatha Dé Danann, the legendary race of godlike beings in Irish mythology, were said to have retreated underground after their defeat by the Milesians, the ancestors of the modern Irish. They became the fairy folk, living in mounds and hollow hills, emerging occasionally to interact with humans. The green children's emergence from the earth near ancient pits echoes this tradition with remarkable precision. In English folklore, the tradition of the fairy hill or the hollow hill is widespread. Thomas the Rhymer, a 13th century Scottish poet, was said to have been taken into a fairy hill by the Queen of Elfland, where he spent what seemed like a few days but was actually 7 years. When he emerged, the world had changed, and he had been given the gift of prophecy. The fairy hill in Thomas's story was entered through a cave or tunnel, much like the passage described by the Green Girl. The legend of the Pied Piper of Hamelin, which is set in Germany in 1284, tells of a mysterious musician who led the children of Hamelin into a cave in a hillside, and they were never seen again. One version of the story says that the children emerged in Transylvania, far from their home, having traveled through a passage under the earth. This is essentially the reverse of the Green Children story. Instead of children emerging from an underground passage into a known village, children disappear into an underground passage and emerge in a distant land. These parallels are suggestive, but they are not proof. The fact that similar stories exist in multiple cultures could mean that similar events have occurred in multiple places. It could also mean that the stories share a common origin in human psychology, in the universal human fear of the underground, the universal human fascination with hidden worlds, and the universal human tendency to explain the unknown in terms of the supernatural. The psychologist Carl Jung would have interpreted the Green Children story as an expression of what he called the collective unconscious, the deep layer of the human psyche that contains universal symbols and motifs shared by all human cultures. According to Jung, myths and legends are not arbitrary inventions, but expressions of fundamental psychological realities. The underground world, the mysterious child, the passage between worlds, these are archetypal images that arise spontaneously in human consciousness because they reflect universal aspects of human experience. Jung might have seen the Green Children as symbols of the emergence of the unconscious into conscious awareness, the eruption of the unknown into the known, the appearance of aspects of the psyche that have been buried and hidden, but that demand recognition and integration. The boy's death and the girl's survival could be seen as representing the partial success of this integration process. Some aspects of the unconscious can be integrated into conscious life, others cannot, and they perish. This Jungian interpretation is elegant and psychologically insightful, but it does not address the historical question of whether the Green Children actually existed. A story can be both psychologically meaningful and historically factual, or it can be psychologically meaningful without being historically factual. Jung's framework helps us understand why the story resonates so powerfully with human audiences, but it does not tell us whether it is true. Let us now examine what modern scholarship has contributed to our understanding of the Green Children. In recent decades, several researchers have conducted detailed investigations into the historical, geographic, and medical dimensions of the story, and their findings have added new layers of complexity to an already complex mystery. One of the most important contributions has been the work of historians who have examined the social and economic conditions of 12th century Suffolk in detail. Their research has revealed that the region around Woolpit was more complex and more cosmopolitan than is often assumed. The wool trade brought wealth and foreign contacts to East Anglia, and the presence of Flemish immigrants was well documented. The Abbey of Bury St Edmunds was a major center of learning and culture, and its influence extended into the surrounding countryside. This research has also revealed that the 12th century was a period of significant demographic movement in England. The Civil War, economic disruption, and social upheaval of Stephen's reign displaced large numbers of people, and the roads and byways of England were traveled by refugees, migrants, and wanderers of all kinds. In this context, the appearance of two unknown children in a Suffolk village, while unusual, would not have been unprecedented. The historian Derek Brewer examined the Green Children story in the context of medieval literary conventions and concluded that while the story contains elements of folklore and literary embellishment, its core is likely based on a real event. Brewer argued that the specific, concrete details of the account, the naming of Richard de Calne, the description of the children's behavior around food, the gradual fading of the green color, are not typical of folklore or literary invention, but are consistent with eyewitness testimony that has been filtered through the conventions of medieval chronicle writing. The folklorist Catherine Briggs included the Green Children in her comprehensive survey of English fairy traditions, noting that the story occupies an unusual position between history and folklore. Briggs observed that the Green Children's story is unique among fairy narratives in that it is supported by contemporary documentation and named witnesses, characteristics that set it apart from the anonymous, undated fairy tales that make up the bulk of the English folk tradition. The researcher Brian Houghton published a detailed investigation of the Green Children in 2006, examining every aspect of the story from the historical sources to the modern theories. Houghton concluded that while no single explanation accounts for all the details, the most likely explanation is that the children were real and that their origins lie in a mundane, though still mysterious, set of circumstances that have been obscured by the passage of time and the limitations of the available sources. Houghton's work is valuable because it takes a balanced, evidence-based approach, neither dismissing the story as pure folklore nor embracing extraordinary explanations without evidence. He acknowledges the mystery while insisting on intellectual rigor, and his analysis provides a solid foundation for further research. More recently, the story has attracted the attention of researchers in the field of archaeoastronomy and historical geography. Some of these researchers have attempted to identify the girl's homeland by matching her description of its physical characteristics to known geographic locations. One intriguing suggestion is that the girl's description of a land of perpetual twilight separated from a bright land by a wide river could match the landscape of certain parts of Scandinavia during the winter months. In the far north of Norway, Sweden, and Finland, the winter months are characterized by extremely limited daylight, with the sun barely rising above the horizon or not rising at all. During this period, the landscape is bathed in a dim, twilight light that can persist for weeks or even months. If the children came from such a location, their description of a twilight world would be literally accurate. The wide river separating the dark land from the bright land could be the Baltic Sea, the North Sea, or one of the major Scandinavian rivers. And the bright land beyond the river could be a reference to the southern parts of Scandinavia or to the European continent, where the daylight is stronger and more consistent. However, this theory faces the same objection as many others. If the children came from Scandinavia, how did they end up in Suffolk? And how did they arrive without anyone noticing? A journey from Scandinavia to Suffolk would have required a sea crossing, and the children would have been seen and remembered by the people who carried them across the water. Unless, of course, they did not travel by sea. Unless they traveled by some other means, some means that we do not understand or cannot explain. And here we are back to the fundamental mystery, the irreducible core of the Green Children story that resists every attempt at rational explanation. Let us now examine the impact of the Green Children story on literature and popular culture, because the story has had an influence that extends far beyond the academic study of medieval history. The Green Children of Woolpit have inspired numerous works of fiction, from novels and short stories to plays and poems. The story's combination of mystery, wonder, and sadness makes it an ideal subject for literary treatment, and writers have returned to it again and again, each finding in it something that speaks to their own concerns and preoccupations. One of the earliest literary treatments of the story is the poem The Green Children by the English poet Herbert Reed, published in 1934. Reed was a major figure in the English literary world, a poet, critic, and theorist of art who was deeply interested in the relationship between the conscious and unconscious mind. His poem retells the Green Children story in haunting, lyrical language, emphasizing the children's alienness and the pathos of their situation. Reed's poem presents the Green Children as beings from a world that is fundamentally different from our own, a world of dream and shadow that exists alongside the waking world but is normally invisible to it. The children's emergence into the sunlit world of Woolpit is presented as a kind of birth, a traumatic passage from one state of being to another, and the boy's death is presented as the inability of the old self to survive in the new world. The novelist Kevin Crossley Holland, who is one of the leading interpreters of English and Norse mythology in contemporary literature, has also written about the Green Children. Crossley Holland's retelling emphasizes the historical and cultural context of the story, placing it firmly within the world of 12th century England and exploring the reactions of the villagers to the children's arrival. The playwright John Wyndham, best known for his science fiction novels such as The Day of the Triffids and The Midwich Cuckoos, was reportedly influenced by the Green Children story in his portrayal of mysterious children with unusual characteristics. The Midwich Cuckoos, in which a group of children with strange powers are born simultaneously in an English village, echoes the Green Children story in its themes of otherness, fear, and the disruption of a rural community by the arrival of beings who are not quite human. In more recent years, the Green Children have appeared in numerous works of young adult fiction, graphic novels, and historical fiction. The story has also been adapted for stage and screen, though no major film or television production has yet done full justice to the complexity and richness of the source material. The Green Children have also had a significant impact on the study of anomalous phenomena. The story is a staple of books and documentaries about unexplained events, and it is frequently cited in discussions of underground civilizations, parallel worlds, and interdimensional travel. The story has become a touchstone for researchers who believe that conventional science does not fully account for all the phenomena that have been observed and recorded throughout human history. In the field of ufology, the Green Children are sometimes cited as evidence of ancient extraterrestrial contact. The green skin is interpreted as an alien biological characteristic, and the underground world is interpreted as an alien base or colony. While this interpretation has no evidentiary support, it reflects the powerful hold that the Green Children story has on the popular imagination and the willingness of people to interpret it through whatever lens is most meaningful to them. The story has also had an impact on the village of Woolpit itself. The village has embraced its association with the Green Children, incorporating them into its local identity and using them to attract visitors. The village sign of Woolpit features an image of the two Green Children, and the story is prominently displayed in local historical materials. The Green Children have become Woolpit's most famous export, a distinction that the village wears with a mixture of pride and bemusement. Now let us return to the theories and push them further. We have examined the mundane theories, the nutritional deficiency theory, the Flemish orphan theory, the captivity theory, and we have examined the extraordinary theories, the parallel world theory, the extraterrestrial theory. But there are additional perspectives that deserve consideration. One perspective that has not received as much attention as it deserves is the religious interpretation. In the 12th century, the Green Children would have been interpreted primarily through a religious lens. The people of Woolpit were Christians, and their understanding of the world was shaped by Christian theology. The appearance of two green-skinned children from the earth would have been understood as an act of God, a miracle or a portent sent by the divine to convey a message to the faithful. But what message? The medieval mind was adept at reading signs and symbols in the natural world, and the Green Children would have been rich in symbolic potential. The color green in Christian symbolism has multiple meanings. It can represent life, growth, and renewal, the green of spring, the green of new leaves, the green of the resurrection. But it can also represent decay, corruption, and death, the green of mold, the green of rotting flesh, the green of the grave. The Green Children could have been interpreted as symbols of either life or death, renewal or corruption, depending on the perspective of the interpreter. The children's emergence from the earth is also symbolically charged. In Christian theology, the earth is both the cradle and the grave of humanity. God formed Adam from the dust of the earth, and to the earth all human bodies return after death. The emergence of living beings from the earth could be interpreted as a symbol of resurrection, a foreshadowing of the general resurrection at the end of time when all the dead will rise from their graves. The boy's death and the girl's survival could be interpreted as a parable about salvation. The boy who could not adapt to the new world represents those who reject the grace of God and perish. The girl who embraced her new life and was baptized represents those who accept God's grace and are saved. This interpretation would have been readily available to a medieval audience steeped in biblical typology and accustomed to reading moral lessons in every event. William of Newburgh, who was an Augustinian canon and therefore a man of deep religious learning, would have been aware of these symbolic possibilities. His decision to include the Green Children story in his chronicle may have been motivated not only by a desire to record an unusual event, but also by a belief that the event carried a religious meaning that was worthy of contemplation. But the religious interpretation, while illuminating, does not answer the historical question. It tells us how the event was understood by the people of the time, but it does not tell us what actually happened. Let us now consider a theory that has been gaining traction in recent years, and that represents perhaps the most sophisticated attempt to explain the Green Children within a purely naturalistic framework. This is what we might call the lost community theory. According to this theory, the Green Children came from an isolated community that had been cut off from the wider world for an extended period. This community might have been located in a remote area of England, perhaps in the dense forests of Suffolk or Norfolk, or in the marshes of the fens. Alternatively, it might have been located in a network of caves or underground chambers, perhaps connected to old mine workings or natural cave systems. The key feature of this theory is that the community's isolation would explain all the unusual characteristics of the children. Their green skin would be the result of a combination of nutritional deficiency and environmental factors specific to their isolated habitat. Their unknown language would be the result of linguistic drift, the natural process by which a language changes over time when it is spoken by an isolated community with no contact with other speakers. Their unfamiliarity with ordinary food would be the result of growing up in a community with a very limited diet, and their description of a twilight world would be a literal description of their underground or heavily forested habitat. Linguistic drift is a well-documented phenomenon. When a community is isolated from other speakers of the same language, its speech patterns change over time, diverging from the parent language until it becomes a distinct dialect or even a separate language. The rate of linguistic change varies, but significant divergence can occur within a few generations. If the Green Children came from a community that had been isolated for several generations, their language might have diverged from the surrounding English dialects to the point of mutual unintelligibility. The nutritional aspects of this theory are also plausible. An isolated community with limited access to diverse food sources would be at risk of nutritional deficiencies, and these deficiencies could cause a range of health problems, including skin discoloration. If the community's diet was heavily dependent on a single food source, such as beans, the children's preference for beans and rejection of other foods would be a natural expression of their dietary habits. The lost community theory is attractive because it explains the Green Children without recourse to supernatural or extraordinary mechanisms. It posits that the children were ordinary human beings from an unusual but not impossible set of circumstances. And it is consistent with the historical reality of 12th century England, where isolated communities did exist and where the landscape contained areas that were largely unexplored and unknown to the wider population. But the theory also raises questions. If an isolated community existed near Woolpit, where are the archaeological traces? Where are the remains of their dwellings, their tools, their burial sites? Archaeological surveys of the area around Woolpit have not revealed any evidence of a hidden or isolated community, though it must be acknowledged that such surveys have not been comprehensive and that the remains of a small, impoverished community might be difficult to detect. And what happened to the community? If the Green Children came from an isolated group, that group presumably continued to exist after the children left. Did they come looking for the children? Did they have any further contact with the outside world? The silence of the sources on this point is puzzling. If there were an entire community of green-skinned people living near Woolpit, one would expect some further evidence of their existence to have surfaced over the centuries, unless the community no longer existed by the time the children emerged. If the community had been destroyed by disease, famine, or violence, the children might have been the sole survivors, wandering through the ruins of their world until they found the passage that led them to Woolpit. This would explain why no one came looking for them and why no further evidence of the community has been found. This is speculation, of course, but it is the kind of speculation that the Green Children story demands. The evidence is insufficient to reach a definitive conclusion, and so we are left to construct scenarios, test them against the available evidence, and judge their plausibility as best we can. Now let us talk about something that has been quietly running beneath the surface of this entire discussion. Let us talk about the nature of truth in historical inquiry. When we study an event that occurred more than 800 years ago, we are not dealing with the event itself. We are dealing with representations of the event, representations that have been filtered through the perceptions, biases, and limitations of the people who witnessed it, the people who talked about it, the people who wrote it down, and the people who copied and transmitted the written accounts over the centuries. Every link in this chain of transmission introduces the possibility of distortion. Witnesses may have misperceived or misremembered what they saw. Storytellers may have embellished or simplified the account. Chroniclers may have shaped the narrative to fit their own theological, political, or literary agenda. Copyists may have introduced errors, and modern readers may impose their own interpretive frameworks on the material, seeing patterns and meanings that the original participants would not have recognized. This does not mean that we should dismiss historical accounts as unreliable. It means that we should approach them with a combination of respect and critical awareness, taking them seriously as evidence while recognizing their limitations. The Green Children story is a good example of this principle in action. The accounts of Ralph of Coggeshall and William of Newburgh are valuable and credible sources, but they are not transparent windows onto the past. They are constructed narratives, shaped by the conventions of medieval chronicle writing and the assumptions of medieval culture. When we read that the children had green skin, we should take this seriously. It was reported by two independent sources, both of which were based on testimony from people close to the events, but we should also recognize that the perception of color is subjective and culturally conditioned. What a 12th century English villager described as green might not match exactly what a modern observer would call green. The word green in Middle English had a broader range of meanings than it does in modern English, encompassing shades that we might describe as gray, yellow-green, or olive. The children's skin might have been a shade that we would describe differently. Similarly, when we read that the children spoke an unknown language, we should take this seriously. But we should also recognize that a 12th century Suffolk farmer's ability to identify foreign languages was limited. The language might have been a recognizable language that happened to be unfamiliar to the specific individuals who encountered the children. If the children had been found by a more cosmopolitan observer, such as a merchant who had traveled abroad, the language might have been identified. These qualifications do not undermine the story, they deepen it. They remind us that the Green Children were real people, not characters in a story, and that their experience was shaped by the same messy, complicated, ambiguous reality that shapes all human experience. Let us now address a question that has been implicit throughout this discussion, but that we have not yet confronted directly. Is it possible that the girl was lying? This is a question that must be asked, even though it feels uncomfortable. The girl was the sole source of information about her origins. The boy died before he could contribute his own testimony. Everything we know about the Green Children's homeland comes from the girl's account, as relayed by Richard de Calne and recorded by the chroniclers. Is it possible that the girl fabricated or embellished her story? Children are capable of elaborate fantasies, and a child in the girl's position, surrounded by adults who were eager to hear about her origins, might have been tempted to tell them what they wanted to hear. The green twilight world, the wide river, the sound of bells, these are the elements of a fairy tale, and a bright, imaginative child might have constructed such a tale to satisfy her audience's curiosity and to secure her own position in the community. If the girl were an ordinary lost or abandoned child, she might have had practical reasons to conceal her true origins. If she were fleeing from an abusive situation, for example, she might have invented a fantastical origin story to avoid being returned to her abusers. If she were from a stigmatized community, such as a group of itinerant workers or a persecuted minority, she might have concealed her background to avoid discrimination. These are real possibilities, and they deserve consideration, but there are arguments against them as well. First, the girl maintained her story consistently over an extended period. She told the same account to multiple people over what appears to have been years, not just in the immediate aftermath of her discovery, but long after she had learned English and integrated into the community. While it is possible to maintain a fabrication over a long period, it is more difficult than maintaining a truthful account, especially for a child. Second, the girl's story contains details that are unusual in fabricated accounts. Fabrications tend to be either highly dramatic and detailed, full of exciting events and vivid characters, or vague and evasive, lacking in specific details. The girl's account falls into neither category. It is specific but undramatic. It describes a world that is different from the known world but not spectacularly so. It contains no villains, no adventures, no dramatic events beyond the journey through the tunnel. This quiet, matter-of-fact quality is more consistent with genuine recollection than with invention. Third, the green skin. If the girl were fabricating her story, she would have had no way to fake the green skin that corroborated it. The green skin was observed by multiple witnesses and persisted for an extended period before gradually fading. Whatever caused it, it was not something the girl could have produced or controlled. The green skin is independent evidence that something genuinely unusual had happened to the children, whether or not the girl's account of their origins is accurate. So while we cannot rule out the possibility of fabrication, the balance of evidence suggests that the girl was telling the truth as she understood it. Her account may have been distorted by the limitations of her language, the trauma of her experience, and the cultural assumptions of her audience, but its core appears to be genuine. Let us now consider one more dimension of this story, one that is rarely discussed, but that may be the most important of all. Let us consider what the Green Children's story tells us about the human response to the unknown. When the villagers of Woolpit found the Green Children, they had a choice. They could have reacted with fear and hostility, driving the children away or even killing them. In many societies throughout history, people who looked different, who spoke differently, who did not fit the established categories of the community, were treated as threats and dealt with accordingly. The history of humanity is tragically full of examples of communities that responded to the unknown with violence and persecution. But the people of Woolpit did not do this. They took the children in. They fed them, they housed them, they tried to communicate with them, they baptized them. They cared for the boy when he fell ill, and they mourned him when he died. They helped the girl learn their language, adapt to their way of life, and eventually find a place in their community. This is not a minor detail. It is, in some ways, the most remarkable aspect of the entire story. In a time of civil war and social breakdown, in a community that was struggling to survive, in a culture that was deeply suspicious of the unfamiliar and the unknown, the people of Woolpit chose compassion over fear. They chose inclusion over exclusion. They chose to treat two mysterious, frightening, green-skinned children as human beings deserving of care and protection. This response speaks to something deep and enduring in the human spirit. It speaks to the capacity for empathy, for kindness, for the recognition of shared humanity, even across the most extreme boundaries of difference. The people of Woolpit could not understand the children's language. They could not explain their appearance. They did not know where they had come from or what they were, but they could see that the children were frightened, hungry, and alone, and they responded to that vulnerability with generosity and compassion. In our own time, when communities around the world are grappling with questions of immigration, diversity, and the treatment of strangers, the story of the Green Children of Woolpit offers a powerful example. It reminds us that the choice between fear and compassion is not a modern invention but a timeless human dilemma, and that the people of the past, despite their limitations and prejudices, were sometimes capable of remarkable acts of kindness toward those who were most different from themselves. The girl who survived, who learned English, who ate new foods, who shed her green skin and became an ordinary member of the community, is herself a testament to the transformative power of inclusion. She was given a chance to belong, and she took it. She built a life in a world that was not her own, among people who were not her people, and she made it work. Whatever her origins, whatever her nature, she became one of them. She became human in their eyes, and they became her family. This is not a fairy tale ending. It is a human ending. It is messy and incomplete and full of unanswered questions. We do not know if the girl was happy. We do not know if she missed her homeland. We do not know if she ever tried to find the passage back. We do not know what she told her children, if she had children, about where she came from. We do not know what she dreamed about at night, lying in an English bed in an English house in an English village, under stars that might or might not have been the same stars she saw in her childhood. We do not know, and maybe that is all right. Maybe the not knowing is part of the story's power. Maybe the mystery is not a problem to be solved, but a gift to be received, an invitation to wonder, to imagine, to reach beyond the boundaries of our own experience, and consider the possibility that the world is larger, stranger, and more beautiful than we have ever allowed ourselves to believe. Let us now bring all the threads together and attempt a synthesis. We have examined the Green Children story from every angle we can think of. We have looked at the historical context, the primary sources, the physical evidence, the medical possibilities, the geographic considerations, the folkloric parallels, the literary legacy, the psychological dimensions, the religious symbolism, and the human drama at the heart of the narrative. What can we conclude? First, we can conclude with reasonable confidence that something unusual happened at Woolpit in or around the year 1150. The convergence of two independent sources, both based on testimony from people connected to the events, is strong evidence that the story has a basis in fact. The specific, concrete details of the accounts are consistent with genuine testimony rather than literary invention or folklore. Second, we can conclude that the children were real. They were not fictional characters invented by the chroniclers. They were living, breathing human beings who were found near the wolf pits, who were taken into the household of Sir Richard de Calne, who exhibited unusual physical characteristics and behaviors, and one of whom died while the other survived and integrated into the community. Third, we can conclude that the children's green skin was a real phenomenon observed by multiple witnesses. Whether the cause was nutritional, environmental, medical, or something else entirely, the green color was not a literary embellishment but a physical characteristic that was noted and remembered by the people who saw the children. Fourth, we can conclude that the children spoke a language that was not recognized by the people of Woolpit. Whether this language was an obscure European dialect, a private language developed in isolation, or something else entirely, it was genuinely unfamiliar to the children's hosts. Fifth, we can conclude that the surviving girl told a consistent story about her origins that included specific details about her homeland, her journey, and the circumstances of her arrival in Woolpit. Whether this story was a literal account of a journey from another world, a garbled description of a journey from a nearby but isolated community, or a constructed narrative that blended real memories with cultural mythology, it was taken seriously by the people who heard it and by the chroniclers who recorded it. Beyond these 5 conclusions, everything is uncertain. We cannot definitively identify the children's homeland. We cannot definitively explain their green skin. We cannot definitively determine their ethnic or cultural background. We cannot definitively say whether the girl's testimony was literally true, metaphorically true, or partially fabricated. What we can do is acknowledge the mystery and resist the temptation to force a premature resolution. The green children of Woolpit have resisted explanation for more than 8 centuries, and they may continue to resist explanation for centuries to come. And that is not a failure of inquiry. It is a recognition of the limits of inquiry, a humble acknowledgement that some questions may not have answers that are accessible to us given the current state of our knowledge and the limitations of the available evidence. But the story is not over. New evidence may yet come to light. Archaeological discoveries in the area around Woolpit might reveal traces of a hidden community. Advances in medical science might provide a more precise explanation for the children's green skin. Developments in historical linguistics might help identify the language the children spoke, and new theoretical frameworks might provide interpretive tools that allow us to make sense of the girls' testimony in ways that we cannot currently imagine. The search for the truth about the green children is ongoing, and it will continue for as long as there are people who are curious enough to ask questions and brave enough to pursue the answers wherever they lead. And perhaps that is the ultimate lesson of the green children story, not the answer but the question, not the destination but the journey, not the solution but the search. The green children emerged from the earth more than 850 years ago, and they stepped into a world that was not ready for them. They challenged everything the people of Woolpit thought they knew about the world. They forced a community to confront the limits of its understanding. And they left behind a mystery that has refused to be solved, a question that has refused to be answered, a story that has refused to be forgotten. The boy died, the girl lived, and the mystery endures. That is the story of the green children of Woolpit, 2 small figures with green skin emerging from the ancient earth of Suffolk into the harsh sunlight of a medieval harvest day. 2 children who should not have existed, who should not have been there, who defied every category and every explanation. 2 children who forced the people around them to choose between fear and compassion, and who were saved by the compassion of strangers. The year was 1150, the place was Woolpit, the world was young and full of wonders, and somewhere perhaps beneath our feet in a land of green twilight where the sun never shines, there is a community that still remembers the 2 children who followed the sound of bells and never came home. Think about that. Think about the parents who lost them. Think about the community that woke one morning to find 2 of its children gone, vanished into the earth, never to return. We focus on the people of Woolpit, on Richard de Calney, on the Chroniclers, on the girl who survived. But somewhere in a place we cannot find and cannot reach, there were people who loved those children and who never knew what happened to them. The green children's story is a mystery, yes. It is a puzzle, a challenge, an enigma, but it is also a tragedy. It is the story of loss, of separation, of children torn from their world and cast into another. It is the story of a boy who could not survive the transition and a girl who could, but who carried the weight of her lost world with her for the rest of her life. And it is the story of a village that, in its finest moment, chose to embrace the unknown rather than to destroy it. The people of Woolpit did not understand the green children. They could not explain them. They did not know what they were or where they had come from, but they opened their doors, they shared their food, they offered their protection, and they gave 2 lost children a home. That is worth remembering. In a world that often fears the stranger, that builds walls against the unknown, that responds to difference with suspicion and hostility, the people of Woolpit remind us that there is another way. They remind us that the unknown is not always a threat. Sometimes it is a gift. Sometimes it is an invitation. Sometimes it is 2 frightened children with green skin who just need someone to take them in. The green children of Woolpit, born in twilight, found in sunlight, lost to history, remembered forever. The year was 1150. The mystery is still alive, and the bells are still ringing, somewhere deep beneath the earth, calling to anyone brave enough to follow their sound into the darkness and discover what lies on the other side. We started this journey by saying that this is one of the most important events in history, and perhaps you wondered when you heard that, how 2 lost children in a medieval English village could be considered one of the most important events in history. After all, the green children did not change the course of wars. They did not influence the fate of nations. They did not make scientific discoveries or create great works of art. They were just 2 children, small and frightened and green, who appeared one harvest day and baffled everyone who encountered them. But importance is not always measured in terms of power, influence, or achievement. Sometimes the most important events are the ones that challenge our assumptions, that force us to question what we think we know, that open windows in the walls of our certainty and let in the cold, fresh air of wonder. The green children of Woolpit are important because they remind us that the world is mysterious. They remind us that there are things we do not understand, things that resist our best efforts at explanation, things that stand at the boundary of the known and the unknown and refuse to be categorized. They are important because they remind us that history is not a closed book. There are chapters we have not yet read, pages that are still being written, stories that are still unfolding. Past is not dead and buried. It is alive, pulsing with unanswered questions and unrevealed secrets, waiting for us to dig deeper, look closer, and listen more carefully. And they are important because they remind us of our own humanity, the compassion of the villagers, the resilience of the girl, the fragility of the boy, the universal human experiences of fear, loss, hope, and adaptation. These are the things that connect us to the people of 12th century England across the vast gulf of time. These are the things that make the Green Children's story not just a historical curiosity, but a mirror in which we can see our own faces reflected. So the next time you walk across a field, the next time you see a pit or a hollow in the earth, the next time you hear the sound of bells ringing in the distance, remember the Green Children. Remember that the world beneath your feet may not be as empty as you think. Remember that the boundaries of the known world are not as firm as you believe. And remember that sometimes in the most ordinary of places, the most extraordinary things can happen. The Green Children of Woolpit, 2 children emerged from the earth with green skin and an impossible story. One died, one survived, neither was ever explained. The year was 1150. The place was Woolpit, Suffolk, England. And the mystery, after all these centuries, remains as deep, as strange, and as compelling as the day those 2 small, green-skinned figures first stumbled into the sunlight and looked up at a sky they had never seen before, shielding their eyes against a brightness they could not bear, reaching out for help in a world they did not understand. They reached out, and the people of Woolpit reached back. That is the story. That is the mystery. That is the lesson. And that is why, more than 850 years later, we are still talking about them. We are still wondering about them. We are still searching for answers. The Green Children of Woolpit, the mystery endures.